I'm so excited to get going on this. I've worked on it a long time, and I just pray that we're all blessed together. Join me in prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we come before your throne today, and we give you praise and honor and glory. And for the stories that unfold before us, we thank you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Once upon a time, not so long ago, there was a farm girl who did chores from sun up to sundown. She milked the cows, she fed the chickens, she plowed the field, she harvested the wheat. But she didn't really mind the work. In fact, she believed that if she worked harder, longer, and perfect enough, that her parents would learn to love her. This girl was determined to ace every test in school, and she did her best. And unlike Rodney Blazer, who bit Mrs. Carstetter in the 3rd grade, this girl never caused any trouble. In fact, she didn't even offer ugly retorts when her peers made fun of her bargain basement clothes and her charity bin shoes. She believed that if she had more friends, that then her parents would love her. Then one day, this girl who grew up entertaining herself by telling stories heard that there was a story contest in her small town. And if you won the story contest, you got to be the queen of the Christmas parade. And so this girl, she entered the story contest because she knew that then her parents would love her. And so after the contest, she ran to the car with the sparkling tiara on her head, and she said, "I won the story contest." And her father said, "Get in the car. The cows still have to be milked in the morning." But the girl, determined as she was not one easy to give up. So she decided that she would do her very best to go to college on a drama scholarship where they talked about story on the stage. And so she worked very hard and got the lead in every play in high school. And her parents said, "Only bad girls pursue the stage." So she changed her major to teaching. And she wasn't in college very long when suddenly she met this handsome young preacher and married him. And she thought then, if she served the Lord, her parents would love her. And 30 years later, she worked to be the perfect pastor's wife, the perfect mother. But her parents didn't love her anymore. Then, on the day the girl turned 50, her husband came home and announced that the church had let him go. There would be no severance, and it wouldn't be long before their savings, meager as it was, would give out. And the girl thought, if only I could get a job. But she'd been working for the church for free for 30 years. The only thing she had to put on her resume was teaching 2-year-olds, hosting teen lock-ins, and throwing ladies' days with nothing more than a can of tuna and a ream of construction paper. Who was going to hire her? Her parents were right. She wasn't worth loving. So this girl went to her bedroom and she fell to her knees and she raised her fist at the Lord and said, "This cannot be my story." Maybe you know this girl. I do. This girl was me. And if you have never shaken your fist at the Lord and said, "Who am I and how did I get here?" live long enough and I promise you will. Because there will be the loss of a dream, the dissolution of a relationship that is dear to you, the death of a loved one, the failure of your health, or the sudden realization that many ships have sailed that you wanted to be on, and you were not. None of us set out to ruin our stories. We want stories that are filled with good and noble deeds and glorious and exciting adventures, not stories befouled by pain and regret and hopelessness. So we do what is known as put a little spin on our story. We go to church and someone asks how we are and we smile and we say, great. Or we post on social media only the good things and we crop and we cut. And tell me I'm not the only one that does that, please. Or the biggest lie of all, we tell ourselves that we're okay, that this mess is okay. Did you know that we are not the first generation to put a creative spin on our story? With the Bible, we have the record of storytelling that goes back to the very beginning. In the beginning, God said, and with words, God spoke into existence this perfect kingdom, and everything was beautiful in this kingdom until there was a war over who would rule this kingdom, and the dragon was cast to the earth. And God wrote this story, and in this story that we all know and love, he laid it all out. And unlike us, he didn't airbrush the bad parts. There, in this story, there is envy. There is hatred. There is murder. There is greed. There are bad guys. There are good guys that do stupid things. There are brave women. There are broken women. And there are women longing for a better hope in this story. And so all seems lost in this story until the Lord sends a hero. And the hero everyone had been waiting on to come with his sword raised high and to raise an army that would fix all the stories that are broken, comes with a bag of stories. That's the weapon he brings. Stories. Why did Jesus tell stories? We learned this week from our study that Jesus didn't invent parables. This was a new concept to me, ladies. When I started working on this, I was shocked to know Jesus did not invent parables. Although he was there in the beginning when the story was told, he didn't come up with parables. In fact, there are records of storytelling that date back 30,000 years with pictures that are painted inside a cave in France. In 1930, Laszlo Almásy, an Hungarian aristocrat who was bored, went out to explore the southern quadrant of the Egyptian desert, the Sahara. And in this, he stumbled across a cave that looked like an upside-down ice cream cone. And when he went inside, the inside of the cave was painted with hundreds and hundreds of images, blood-red images dating back about 10,000 years. And in this story, we learn the story of a region when this region of the world was lush and green, and people lived with rhinos and giraffes. And there are hundreds of these little swimmers. They're about 5 centimeters long with little pot bellies, and they're all over the wall. And Almásy was fascinated by the idea of swimmers in the desert. So he named the Cave of the Swimmers, which became the inspiration for the mediocre movie, The English Patient, and the inspiration for my mediocre series, The Carthage Chronicles. So anyway, in this story, when you're standing among these swimmers, it's hard to imagine how this storyteller, this desert storyteller, came up with the concept of water, especially when you step out and there's nothing but sand for miles. And so some thought it was just fiction or wishful imagination on the part of the artist that painted this story on the cave walls. But do you know, a few years ago, scientists discovered that only a few hundred feet below this cave of the swimmers is the largest underground aquifer in the world. That if the people in this region could stop fighting long enough to tap into that resource, that they could green up the Sahara, and if they greened up the Sahara, it would change the climate of the world. An ancient truth discovered by the discovery of an ancient story. So when Jesus comes to establish this new kingdom, he doesn't come with a bag of new tricks. He comes with what he knows. And there are 3 reasons I believe Jesus decided to tell stories. First of all, stories have the power to change us. We are wired for story. When I said the words, once upon a time, all of you who were still standing around talking, you quit talking. Because you leaned in, because you are wired for story. I would love to believe that it's because I'm such a fabulous storyteller that you wanted to hear, but the truth is you are wired for story. Scientists have recently discovered that during tests of before, during, and after someone listening to a story, that our brains create 2 chemicals. One is cortisol. And cortisol is the hormone or the chemical or whatever you want to call it that makes us want to pay attention. It's what heightens every sense in us and makes us wonder where, is there an attack coming? Our attention becomes very sharpened. And then as the story goes along and you're paying attention now, then the body creates something called oxytocin. And oxytocin is the stimulant, the hormone, the chemical reaction that causes connection and then care and then empathy. Strangely, the more oxytocin that a person produces, the more likely they are to give money to a stranger. So in other words, scientists have proven that stingy behavior can actually be changed by altering our brain chemistry. Doesn't it stand to reason that other behaviors could be altered as well by the production of these 2 chemicals in our brain? How do these changes come about? Well, scientists say it's because they have found that when these chemical changes occur, our brain is able to mentally transport us into someone else's world. We can actually see the world from another's point of view. This chemical reaction has the power to make us want to get out of ourselves. Does that remind you of a parable that we talked about today? When a rich man maybe should have gotten out of himself for just a minute instead of tripping over someone else. It's why Jesus started his stories with this phrase so many times, who among you? He was telling stories that he knew would transport these people that were listening into the life of whomever he was talking about. He wanted to move them from their little narrow paradigms or their little prejudices or their traditions and their ways of thinking, and it was like he was taking them on a drone and setting them where they could have a bird's eye view of another person's point of view. And when we get another point of view, it changes our behavior, whether our point of view needs to be from a beggar man's mat or a rich man's table. Whatever our point of view needs to be shifted, it can change our behavior, because a change in our perspective changes our behavior, and that changes the way we treat each other. In other words, stories don't make us like each other more. They make us more like each other. By knowing someone's story, we can know where they came from, what they do, and the concerns. We can narrow them down and find out they're worried about the same things we are. They're worried about getting older. They're worrying about how to pay their bills. They're worrying about their kids that aren't behaving right. They're worrying about how to keep a roof over their heads. They're worrying about the same things we are. And the faster that we can form these meaningful relationships with complete strangers, the bigger projects that can be accomplished, like building bridges or sending people to the moon. Relationships give us a sense of purpose, and a united sense of purpose brings peace to the kingdom. Isn't that what Jesus came to do? Bring peace to the kingdom. Jesus told stories because stories change us. But Jesus also told stories because stories change others. I believe Jesus was on a limited time frame, like Cinderella. When the sun set on Calvary, his mission was going to convey into the hands of people with really messy backstories. And it was going to convey into the hands of people who had the human propensity to screw up the story he wanted told. When God sent Jesus to earth, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. On the upside, Rome had ringed the known then world with roads, which made it very easy for people to travel and for ideas to circulate. And despite Rome's constant expansion and the growing pains that caused, for the most part, the world was at peace. On the downside, there were pagan idols on every corner and built into the niches of every Roman home. And then to make matters worse, the Jewish religion had so codified itself that it was brittle, to the point that any new idea that was poured into it, there was no room for a personal relationship with God, and that would threaten to split the Jewish organization apart. Because you see, there were people who made their living being the intermediary between man and God. And those people had a lot to lose if the everyday person could get in touch with God himself. And they were not thrilled to work with people who were racially, socially, economically, or educationally different than them. Meanwhile, Palestinian economic conditions were so dire that Jesus knew there would be the risk of war if the poor and the outcast listeners heard him say that he had come to free them from Rome's oppression. And politics was not the war he had come to fight. His war was for our souls. When you examine what the ministry of Jesus was up against, if he'd had an extra 50 to 100 years, that would not have helped the ordinary man. But Jesus was no ordinary man. Remember, he was there when cortisol and oxytocin were created. When God started the story with "in the beginning." So Jesus taps into this secret power of stories. Let me give you a few facts about parables that you may or may not have had time to cover in your group. Scholars disagree on how many different stories or parables Jesus told. Some of the lists I looked at said there were 30 some, and some of the list had as many as 67. And nobody ever lets me do the math, so I didn't sit there and count any of them. I have no idea. The Gospel of Luke contains the largest number of parables with 24. Matthew has 23. Mark weighs in with 8, and some argue there may have been a parable or two in John. The longest parable is the prodigal son in Luke 15, with 391 Greek words and 500 words in English. The shortest parable is Luke 4, Physician, heal thyself. There are different genres of parables. There are similitudes or similar experiences, like the joy in finding something you've lost. I know this experience because this week alone I could not find my phone, and I was talking to my friend Gina on the phone, and the whole time I was looking for my phone. Yep, similar experiences. There are evangelic parables, there are prophetic parables, and there are allegorical parables. Just to name a few. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test over this because I don't even know what most of those words mean. But the audiences to whom the stories were told is varied. And sometimes we don't know for sure exactly who Jesus was talking to when he told the story. There were times he talked to the Pharisees, times he talked to the disciples, sometimes he talked to both at the same time, men and women at the same time, and he even talked to Gentiles. That's right. This Jew told his story to Gentiles, and the stories would not have seemed strange to a Gentile because of their everydayness. Everydayness of it transcends cultures in much the same way as you all can watch the Harry and Meghan documentary. Don't tell me you haven't peeked at that just a hair. And I bet some of you have the spare on pre-order. But you don't have to be a royal to understand a culture you can only dream about or see on TV or wonder about, because we all understand greed, we understand power, we understand family that you can't stand sometimes. And so that's the everydayness of it that would have translated. And these are called universal themes, and universal themes transcend culture and time. And the timelessness of Jesus' parables sticks with us today. We have words that we use in our modern language that come from the parables. Prodigal. I say the word prodigal, and we all know exactly what that means. That child's a prodigal, but that child's come home. Or words like lost sheep. Oh, they're just lost sheep since their mama died. Just lost sheep. Good Samaritan. Well, I don't know what I would have done if that Good Samaritan hadn't come along and given me a can of gas. The timelessness of these parables transcend into our modern world today. In the same way, a preacher might use the same good story they stumbled upon in several different lessons, not week after week. They do sprinkle it out a year or two. The same way, it is believed that Jesus told these same stories many times in many different situations. Now, why would he do that? It's because when we listen to stories, we interpret stories based on the experiences and the needs that we bring to that story. We hear what we want to hear, or if the storyteller's really good, you hear what you need to hear. For example, when I read the story of the rich man and Lazarus, I hear about greed and self-absorption. Why do I hear about that? Well, I can be stingy sometimes. And remember, I'm the girl who wanted a tiara. So it's all about me. I can read that into it, and I can see something in myself that needs to change. Perhaps you're dealing with a severe illness, and you hear this story of the rich man and Lazarus, and you hear about a reward. You hear about sickness no more. You hear about sitting in Abraham's bosom without a sore on your body. Or perhaps you hear this story and there's this underlying current of prejudice in your life where you willingly ignore people of a different color who live across the street? Stories speak to us in our need. Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of Eat, Pray, Love, tells the story that I love about an email she got from a reader fan. And this fan just thanked her profusely for writing this sentence in there that changed her life. And Elizabeth was glad that her work had such an impact. But then she got to thinking, I don't remember writing that. And so she did a word search. You can do a search and find. She couldn't find that in there anywhere. Then it was really bugging her. So she read every word of her manuscript again to try to find what this reader was going on and on about, and she didn't find it. And the reason she didn't find it is when that reader read that story, that reader read what she needed to hear. She got from that story what she needed to hear. With one simple story, Jesus could simultaneously launch the spiritual reformation of multiple hearts. And remember, he's on a time limit. The clock is ticking. And he could speak to 5,000 different people at once and offer 5,000 different and appropriate solutions to the mess they'd made of their story. By starting stories with the friction of cultural situations, like farmers building watchtowers to keep the thieves out, or rich men ignoring beggars, or kings going to war, these things that they dealt with every day, living on the razor's edge of poverty, this distress activated the listeners' cortisol, and they couldn't help but lean in. They wanted to know, what are you going to do about these things, Jesus? And then once he had their attention, he got to the point of what he really wanted them to hear, and he would flip the script, and their oxytocin would just go crazy when they heard about rich men ending up in eternal destitution while poor men took the seats of honor at the heavenly banquet table. And without a single lecture, people began to see things from a different point of view. And having a different point of view initiated their empathy, and empathy is what is needed to alter behavior. And we see this in the rich women in Luke 8 who supported Jesus out of their own means. It was possible for rich men to change their thinking. We see this process again in one of my favorite, the inner circle of Jesus, who must have heard his stories until like my dad, every time we get together and he'd start a story. And he told the same story so many times we numbered them. It's number 13, he's talking number 13. And we could just tune out because he told the same stories over and over again. And I'm sure the apostles in the inner circle who traveled with him heard these same stories over and over again. But remember James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were so excited about the kingdom that Jesus was building, and they got a little bit overzealous, and they sent their mom in to ask that they could have the best places in the kingdom on the right and on the left. And of course, all the other apostles said, "Are you kidding me? What's up with that?" And they threw a fit. And so Jesus tells a story. He tells the story of the cost of following him. And I believe this story was extremely effective because that never comes up again. And it changes the life of James and John because according to tradition, James was beheaded for his faith, and John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. Stories have the power to change others. And finally, and I think the most fascinating reason Jesus told stories is because stories give us a glimpse into the mindset or worldview of the storyteller. As a storyteller, I know that you cannot read a Lynn Gentry story without knowing what's important to me. I love humor. I love family, and I believe in the intrinsic value of every human being because we were created in the image of God, and that's where our value comes from. But if you really want to know about Lynn Gentry, then you're going to see another glimpse into why this is important to me. As a woman who always struggled with worth, I am on this quest to prove that I am worthy. And so even when I don't try to write about worth in my stories, it just bleeds in because it's who I am. It's part of my worldview. And the beauty of looking at the stories Jesus told us is that we get to see what mattered to Jesus. I'm sure during the course of his life, and especially during his ministry, he was asked many ridiculous and annoying questions. But only when those questions touched on what mattered to him did he stop and tell a story. In just the stories we studied this week, we saw 4 important insights into what mattered to Jesus. First of all, diversity and inclusion is a heart issue. We can say that slogan all we want, diversity and inclusion. But until hearts are changed, until the cortisol and the oxytocin get going and our behavior change and we actually treat people like Jesus would have us treat people, diversity and inclusion is going to remain a hollow slogan. Number 2, seeing the brokenness of others and taking actionable steps to help them is the first step in healing our own brokenness. When our perspectives change and we see the world from another perspective, it forces us into actionable steps. Imagine the change that would have been effectuated in the rich man had he actually seen the beggar at his gate. You know that good buzzy feeling that comes from giving stuff away. The rich man denied himself this feeling of feeling good. And he also denied himself an eternity in Abraham's bosom. Number 3, redirecting our focus on the King of the kingdom will cost us everything. I know in a room full of women this size that there are some in here who have paid it all to follow the Lord. Maybe you're estranged from some family members. Maybe you've had your heart broken by your kids because you clung to your faith and your convictions. Maybe you didn't get invited to go with some of the people after work because, you know, how Lynn's a stick in the mud. Let's don't ask her. There are costs to following Jesus. And the cost is giving up yourself. And that's the biggest price to pay. And some of us aren't willing to pay it. And number 4, exchanging old lies for new truths will stretch us until we burst. But it is the only way Jesus can effectuate change in us, is when we let go of all those old lies that Satan would have us believe, and we accept truth into our hearts. Our stories are not meant to be tucked away. What the Lord has done for us has a place in God's overall story, and our stories matter because we matter to God. That's the story, and that's the story we must tell. Well, of course, I can't end this session on stories without a story. So here we go. Our first time pastorate, my husband was in ministry for 30 years. I guess that means I was too. And we were in ministry for 30 years, and our first full-time pastorate was in South Georgia. And we hadn't been there a month when the elders said the preacher's wife always teaches ladies' Bible class. Well, I'd been to ladies' Bible class twice in my life by then, and it was there at that church, and I knew enough to know that the teacher, Miss Elizabeth, who was 6'2" and could run a ladies' Bible class with one hand tied behind her back and never crack a smile, and loved teaching ladies' Bible class, would not be happy about this information. And besides, I was all of 24 years old. There wasn't a woman in there under 60. I had a Bible that I had read some, and that's all I knew. What could I possibly have to teach these women who were old enough to be my grandmother? But remember, I was going to be the perfect pastor's wife, and so I said, okay, and I did what any self-respecting pastor's wife would do the next Sunday. I hid from Miss Elizabeth. But not only was the woman stout, she was quick, and she cut me off in the sanctuary aisle, and I looked up at her. She towered over me, and I braced myself for the tongue lashing that I surely deserved, trying to assert her authority in ladies' Bible class. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you have a sewing machine?" What? Do you own a sewing machine? I nodded, but I didn't dare confess I didn't know how to plug it in. She said, "Good. Bring it and your baby to my house tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, sharp." Miss Elizabeth's sewing room was a magical place of light and fabric, and she had 4 sewing machines. She didn't need mine, and thread and buttons, and laid out on the cutting table in the middle was a gorgeous piece of fabric and a little tiny sundress pattern for my daughter. And as she taught me how to tell the grain of a fabric and lay the front on the fold, she said, "I'm going to tell you a story. Sit." So I did. And she began to tell me that she was widowed at 35 and left with 6 children. She said, "I didn't know how I was going to keep a roof over our heads. My husband's business was a mess, but I had no choice but to take it up. And some nights I went to bed with my shoes on. I was so tired. And most mornings I didn't want to get up, and I didn't know how I was going to make it, and I would have given up had I not trusted my God to be with me." Then she reached across the cutting board and she took my hand and she said, "That same God who was with me is with you, and so am I." From that day on, Miss Elizabeth was on the front row of ladies' Bible class. She didn't smile, but she gave me a nod of approval every time. 2 years into my teaching tenure, and now I'm feeling all good about myself, Miss Elizabeth has a stroke, and it paralyzes her on her right side. And so now her little mouth droops. But she has her husband wheel her to the front of ladies' Bible class. And I'll never forget that first Tuesday, right before I got up, she reached for me with her left hand, and she took it, and she said, "God with you." Remember when my life was in shambles and I was on my knees in my bedroom shaking my fist at God? Do you know, it was not a single sermon I'd ever heard or a single scripture I ever read that came to my mind. What came to my mind was Miss Elizabeth reaching for me with her left hand and saying, "God with you." Because she was brave enough to tell me the truth of her story, that the reason God had come into this world was for her in her story. All those chemicals went to work in my brain, and I got up off the floor, and it changed my perspective, which in turn changed my behavior, which changed my life. Since that dark day, I have written 20 books. Our stories are not over. As long as we have breath in our body, our stories are not over. Jesus promises that he does not come to us in our past and our mistakes, that he comes to us in our destiny. And that, dear sisters, is the story we are called to tell, and we must tell it to anyone who will listen. I beg you, come sit with me at the feet of the master storyteller and let him pour new wine into your parched souls. Pray with me. Oh, great storyteller, this one who created the story, into whom has a chapter for me, a place for me, and a place for each one of the women in this room. We confess to you that our stories are a mess, and that it is a mess of our own making for the most part. Father, we ask in your grace and in your mercy that you redeem our stories for your glory, and that you give us the courage to tell the world what you have done for us and what you can do for them. Thank you. Go in peace.